Hello, and welcome to Humanities Headlines. I'm Georges Van Den Abbeele, Dean of the School of Humanities at the University of California, Irvine, and I'm here today with Professor Christine Balance to talk about popular music and Filipino American culture. Now, Christine, you've been working on a book about popular culture in Philippine America called Tropical Renditions. What's the backstory on this book? What are you trying to do?
I feel like my whole life is a backstory to this book. So basically, I grew up a child of Filipino immigrant parents. And so throughout, karaoke was always around. We were always made to perform, music at family parties or in churches. By the time I got to college, I was part of a theater called Bindle Stiff Studio in San Francisco that used to do live musical events and so on. So, watched television and saw, a lot of Filipino singers like on shows like The Voice and American Idol. And so, but by the time I got to grad school, I was noticing there actually, for all this music that was happening amongst Filipino Americans, there was no book on Filipino Americans in music. And what I realized was that there was actually this paradox that on the one hand, Filipinos were seen as being very innately musical people, and on the other, they were also seen as not having a musical culture. And so that kind of paradox drew me to thinking, well, rather than trying to find this musical culture, which I knew was existing, maybe it was about the way people were listening. For these stories with, scholarly accounts of it, journalistic accounts. And maybe within those stories that they were writing, there was certain tropes or certain ways that were holding them back from actually listening and hearing the music properly.
So how did you go about studying that? Like you found certain case studies in each of your chapters. What kind of materials did you look at? And how would that fit into the approach you were taking?
Well, unlike they tell most grad students, my book was not all of my dissertation. It was only one chapter.
Sure, yeah.
And that was the chapter that looked at the Invisible Scratch Pickles, who are a turntablist DJ crew. So DJs not just in that they mix songs, but they actually make new music from previous recordings. So from there, I just decided that I think within U.S. popular music studies, whenever the term race comes up, it's always assumed that it's going to be about hip hop. Right. And so I wanted to work against that. And so I chose case studies that were either indie musicians, rock musicians, popular, more pop musicians, and in order to sort of work against, again, be disobedient to what was assumed was going to be there in terms of race and pop.
And demonstrate some of the diversity of styles and approaches that were taken. Yeah. Now, one of the things you do, which I think is really interesting and unusual, is you focus on both Filipino and Filipino American musicians, so kind of crossing that, Asian American split. And why did you do that? And what was the thought behind that?
Well, I think for multiple reasons. First of all, as a musician myself, I'm in a band, and our band's lead singer's brother is actually also in a band, but in Manila. And so I was sort of seeing on the ground level this type of exchange that happened between sort of musicians here in the US and those in the Philippines. I also have a chapter on Jessica Hagedorn, as well as another one on that music festival that I was mentioning earlier. It was called Pinoy's Pop, and that was started by two immigrant brothers who came from the Philippines to the US. And so I think, part of Asian American studies and crossing that kind of divide between Asian America is trying to understand that, as part of immigration, it's not just one way of assimilating to culture and leaving your culture behind. And at the same time, that because of wars in Asia, U.S. culture has already been in a lot of Asian countries before. So I kind of wanted to demonstrate that and show that through the case studies that I chose.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, because there's a lot of continual interchange, and there's continual immigration. There's also migration back, and among family connections and stories, and music is obviously part of how that cultural exchange happens. That's interesting to see that.
And I think that too, it's like, I think in this day and age, we always think of digital media and kind of the transnational turn happening because of the internet.
Yeah.
But, if we look at the work of folks like Sarah Cohen is one woman who looks at, sites like US military bases, or these kind of underground radio stations, right, that distributed music way before, in these kind of underground, maybe illicit contraband ways. For me, it would be sending cousins mixtapes that I had made from the US, right? So that it wasn't necessarily about, that even in the pre-digital age, there was still some kind of exchange that was happening. And music allows for that.
Obviously, you've had to have gone to countless performances in doing this research. Are there some ones that particularly stand out in your mind or have some particular significance to your project?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of them, the one thing is, I guess for those who are interested in researching in the Philippines, one thing you learn is that a lot of folks there don't really use email, and they don't make phone calls. A lot of it's through Facebook and texting.
Interesting.
So again, kind of working against our understanding of how the non-West actually communicates, right?
So this is in terms of performance venues or things like that.
Yeah, so to find out about a gig, a lot of it is just happening on Facebook. And so one of the things is this time that I had kind of dropped into Manila, found out that a lot of the local bands were going up to Baguio, which is about 7 hours away. It was a large kind of US military outpost. It's where a lot of Americans liked to go during the colonial period because it's about 30 degrees cooler than it is in the city. So they were going to go on this little tour that they were about to start. And so I went up, my husband and I, and hung out with them for the weekend and got to actually meet, other kind of local bands. And so I think it really, in terms of that performance, it helped me understand that the Philippines, as much as it is a nation, is also an archipelago, right? And that there actually are large distinctions between those who are in Manila making music and, and then those who are kind of, as they call it, up the mountain in Baguio, making music there. And so, in that sense, going on that tour with those performers really taught me to think more of this archipelagic perspective towards, you know what I mean?
So would the distinctions among various places, different islands in the Philippines archipelago be almost as significant as differences between the Philippines and Filipino America? Or not? I don't know. I'm just kind of wondering.
Yeah. Well, I think that the thing is
I mean, rather than making, Philippine identity one thing and Philippine American identity another, and that you talk about that, but within them there seems to be maybe as much variety.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that there is actually this impasse between Filipino studies, Filipino American studies, and those, they're kind of attendant communities. And a lot of it has to do around nationhood and how these nations are imagined. And so I think as somebody who grew up Filipino American, to understand that the Philippines is this actually varied place, as varied as, the term America is, was really important to my project. And I think that if it weren't for these bands on this tour at this particular performance, I wouldn't have really had that kind of realization.
So were there other kind of realizations that you had in the course of this book, or assumptions that you had entering into the project that were then changed or surprised you as you went through?
Yeah, I think I would have, I was constantly fighting against this kind of the knee-jerk reaction of like, oh, all the Filipino American music is karaoke, which is, I think, also an assumption that I grew up with, and so I had to constantly work against. And again, growing up in the US, my assumptions towards Filipinos' relationship to music really changed once I went to the Philippines. You know, the one thing I always tell my students is the way we have to imagine our relationship to the Philippines is not, you know, it's not sepia toned, it's not, you know, that kind of old-fashioned provincial place. It's actually a very modern, you know, metropolitan, city. And so, to kind of constantly undo that was just really important. I think also every time I talk to an artist, whether it was Jessica Hagedorn about her growing up in 1970 San Francisco and 1980s New York, or again, Jesse and Oji Gonzalez, who were these immigrant brothers who started this music festival. I always came in thinking I knew the story, but I also knew that I needed to stop myself in order to really listen to what they were having to say or presenting. So,
well, thank you very much. And so I want to thank again Professor Christine Balance. I'm Georges Van Den Abbeele, Dean of the School of Humanities, UC Irvine. Thank you, and tune in next time for the next Humanities Headlines.